Family. Everybody's got one of some kind. But the pressure on family is huge these days. How do you know when you're doing a good job as a family or as a parent? And what do you do when demands on your time keep you from being the kind of parent you want to be? How do you move forward when your modern family just isn't working? We're all working as hard as we can in raising a family, but sometimes it seems like our capacity isn't quite enough. Your modern family isn't perfect. No family is perfect. But what if God isn't holding up a perfect picture? He's writing a bigger story. What if church and family work together to discover that story? What if God could really use your family, no matter where you're at? Modern families.
Well, I'm so glad you've joined us for part 3 of our 5-part series called Modern Families, because we all kind of start out in families and we're affiliated with families in one way or another. And here's what we're trying to do in this series. We're trying to figure out what God is saying to families today. So we're really glad you've joined us. And if you were here for last week, you got to meet Reggie Joyner and hear some incredible things that he had to say about what happens when you widen your relational circle as a family and the influence you have as parents. And today you're in for a treat. I get to introduce you to Jeff Brody. Jeff wears the hat of our Director of Family Ministry here at Connexus at our campuses. He also spends most of his time as Director of Student Ministry. So that means he looks after junior high and high school, extreme and inside out, and college-age kids. And if you know Jeff, you probably also know Jen Bailey, our Director of Children's Ministry. And together, they and their team of literally over 100 volunteers work so hard each week to help families win at home and to help children and students really connect with a Heavenly Father who loves them. If you know Jeff, you know that not only is he a great student ministry director, he's a great guy, he's got a great heart, a huge sense of humor, and he's just an incredible leader. So it's my privilege to introduce you to Jeff Brody. And the other thing you'll notice is he's got great taste in wardrobe. Do you see that? Isn't that great?
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff.
Thanks, Carrie. Got my Connexus uniform on, so I'm ready to go. Well, good morning. It's great to be with you here this morning. And I have the privilege of working with the students here at Connexus and working in partnership with Jen Bailey, who is an incredible children's ministry director. And I just count it again, a super privilege to be involved here in Connexus and involved in what God is doing. And we've got a lot of stuff happening with the Modern Family series. I mean, a whole series dedicated to family. I mean, I work in family ministry. How much more exciting can it be? And so we're going to have, we got a great family experiment you're going to hear about at the end of this message, and a number of different things that we're so excited about. But we have an incredible group, as Carrie said, of volunteers working with our children and with our students. We've got small group leaders who trying week in, week out to say the same thing a good parent would say. Setting up groups so that children and students are running in the same direction. And it's a pretty exciting thing to be a part of. I mean, I might be a little biased, but I think, family ministry is where it's at if you're looking for a place to serve. And we just find what God is doing there is just more and more encouraging every day. And today, I'm here to talk to mostly to adults, mostly to parents. We've got some high school kids in the room too, and mostly I spend my time communicating in front of students and not in front of adults. This is kind of a special treat for me to be here with you this morning. And I think I kind of have a unique perspective on things. I have a 2 and a 4-year-old at home, and then I work with teenagers during the week. So the interesting piece is some things are very different and some things are very similar. My 4-year-old right now just thinks that I can do no wrong, and he wants to be just like me. And if you're the parent of teenagers, you know that that's going to end very soon. And right now he's into this thing where he wants to make sure that we're wearing the same color of underwear. That's very important to him. And so in the morning, he always wants to check, what color underwear are you wearing? You're wearing your grays, your blacks, or your pinks, or whatever. And he says to me, we need to wear the same color of underwear. And I think to myself, when I drop him off at school, I wonder who he's kind of showing his underwear to all day long. Now, those of you who are parents of teenagers, particularly teenage boys, when you drop them off at school, you've got the same worry that I have, right? You're wondering, how low are their pants and who are they showing their underwear to? And but we're all having fun. We're all trying to figure it out together, and it is a journey. But one thing we all have in common is we all, in some way, have family. We're all, in some way, connected to family. And by being connected to family, we all know about family fights. And you might think that there's some family out there that you know that never fights, and it's not true. Every family fights. Some families fight cold. It's the silent treatment and the evil eye across the dinner table and the whispering behind the back and the nasty looks and sort of that cold tension in the house. And some families fight hot. It's stomping up the stairs, it's I hate you, and all those things that we don't really mean, and doors slamming and maybe stuff flying depending on your house. And we all have experienced family fights, and every family fights. And family fights often come when two ideas about the rules, two ideas about principles, two ideas about boundaries kind of collide together. And then when they collide together, they explode in a relational way. They collide together and they explode in a relational way. When I was probably about 13, I remember there's a party that I really wanted to go to. And I was so excited about this party. And I remember going to my mom and nervously asking my mom, Mom, I'd really like to go to this party, and do you think I could go? And my mom says to me, of course, well, go ask your dad. So I go, I hear some people have done that. So then, so I go and ask my dad, and I'm nervous, and I say, Dad, I'd really like to go to this party. My dad asked me some questions, and eventually says, you know what? I just don't think it's a good idea. Now at that point, there were two ideas, two principles, two rules about life kind of colliding. My dad's principles were all about, this party, and there's probably some sort of not so good influences there. There's probably some things happening at that party I don't want my son to be involved in. It's probably not the best environment for him, so I'm going to decide no, he can't go. I, however, was operating on a different set of principles. And my principle was very simple. The principle was, if there are pretty girls at that party, I'm going to be there. And I don't know what happened when he said no, but the whole thing just exploded in a relational way. I stomped out of the room. I stomped out the front door. I slammed the door behind me. Then I was on the porch. And my parents live in this kind of Victorian century home with a wraparound porch. And I started screaming from the porch, my dad doesn't know anything. My dad doesn't let me do anything. My parents are losers. My parents don't let me go to parties. They don't let me hang out with my friends. And the momentum just started to grow, And I'm running. Now I'm running on the porch back and forth, and I'm almost dancing, My parents don't know what they're talking about, and I want everybody to know that my parents are so lame. And it gets to the point where it's past adrenaline, where I'm actually having to work at it and be intentional about it. And I'm screaming, I'm yelling, and then we lived on the main street of town. So lights are flicking on all over the street, right? And there's silhouettes of people in the windows. And I'm screaming and I'm yelling about how I hate my parents and they never let me do anything. And I'm screaming and yelling and I'm almost dancing. And then my best friend who was kicking around that day says to me, what are you doing? And I remember I was out of breath at that point. And I looked at him and I said, isn't it obvious? I'm embarrassing my dad. And at that point, I think even when the words left my lips, I realized that my dad wasn't the one being embarrassed. And I remember kind of sneaking in the back door. And the reality is that's what happens often when it comes to family fights. That ideas about rules and principles and boundaries collide, and they kind of explode in a relational way. But as parents, we all want to have relationships with our kids. Whether they're 2 or 12 or 22 or 42, we want to have relationships with our kids. But there's this tension that we have to manage between kind of the rules, the boundaries, the principles, and the relationship. The rules and the relationship. And on the rules side, you know, when you're on the rules side, it's all about, you know, curfews and keeping your room clean, and maybe like on the extreme, you're on the extreme of the rules. You've got a schedule on your fridge about who's going to do chores when, and there's rules about, you know, where things go and how they go, and everything has its place, and every place has its thing, and you're kind of creating all these boundaries, and you're really keeping close tabs, and some of you say, yeah, that's the way to go. That's what I aspire to be. I want those boundaries and rules, and I want them so clear. And some of you are thinking, yeah, I know that guy. He lives on my street. And I mean, I've tried that. And that guy is so uptight. I mean, he probably sleeps in like a 3-piece suit or something. I mean, he's so intense about the rules, and he's just on top of his kids. And the reality is, when it comes to sort of rules-based parenting, it's really fear-based parenting. It's not about what we want for our kids. It's about what we don't want. We're afraid. I'm afraid they're going to have a consequence. I'm afraid something's going to happen to them. I'm afraid they're going to make a poor decision. I'm afraid they're going to ruin their reputation. I'm afraid they're going to ruin my reputation. And most of all, the worst one, I'm afraid they're going to end up like me. And we're so afraid that we create boundaries and rules, and we're on the defense all the time. And we know we're leaning to the rules side. We know we're leaning that way when we say things like, well, you know, we're not Sally's parents, we're your parents. And that's what we have to say. Or, well, if Sally were going to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge, would you jump off the Brooklyn Bridge? When you use those things that have been used for generations, you are leaning on the rules side. But then you got the relationship side. And some people land on the relationship side. And on the extreme of the relationship side, it's all about love. It's all about freedom. It's all about discovering who you are, you know. All you need is love, and love is all you need. I mean, the Beatles had it right. And you know, what that looks like, it's, well, you know, they need to make their own choices, and they need to know what consequences are like. You know, we don't want to create too many boundaries. We don't want to push them away relationally. You know, it's not like whether they drink or don't drink. It's the fact that, like, they let us know. And on sort of the extreme of the freedom side, you know, when some of you are looking at that, and you're saying even right now, I know that guy. And, like, it's all about freedom and love. I mean, it's like granola and tie-dye. I mean, it's like something right out of the 60s. And I can't even believe I married that guy. And the fact that I mean, it's just way, way, way out there. But you know, relationship-based parenting, where it's just about the relationship, is really fear-based too. It's about fear of, if I create boundaries, if I create rules, if I create principles, am I going to push them away? And if I push them away, are they going to come back? If I create these rules and boundaries, am I going to ruin the relationship? Are my kids going to do something I regret? So I better just leave them alone, and I better just give them the freedom to explore. And really, we're again, it's not what we want for our kids, it's what we don't want for them. And again, we're parenting on the defense. And you know you're leaning to the relationship side, you know, to the extreme when you're replying to your daughter's 13-year-old friends on Facebook, right? And you're involved in all the drama and telling them they shouldn't treat her that way. You're on the relationship side there. And the reality is, you know, deep down, we all know that kids who are sort of 0 to 18 aren't looking for 45-year-old friends. They're looking for 45-year-old parents. So what are we supposed to do? I mean, on one side you got the rules, and on one side you got the relationship, and some of us are running back and forth, right? It's the whole, I think this week we should be more on the rules, because last week we were more on the relationship, or, you know, we're on holidays now, so we probably should be more relationship than we should be rules. And so it's like passive-aggressive parenting, right? And your kids are just doing this, right? And it's one day you're one thing, and one day the other, and 1 week you're one thing, 1 week you're the other, and 1 week you read this book, and it's all about rules, and 1 week you read this book, and it's all about relationship. And how are we supposed to figure this out? I mean, are we supposed to just land in the middle? Is it all about balance? What do we do with all this? Well, the Bible has some interesting things to say about that. In fact, Jesus himself addressed this whole tension of rules and relationship. And I think this morning, whether this is your first time in church or you've been in church many times, whether you're just trying to figure out this whole Jesus-God thing, or maybe, you're a parent, maybe you're not a parent, I think this is going to be something valuable to you because we're going to be looking at a universal truth today that Jesus shares with us. We're going to look at Matthew 22. Matthew 22. And I'm going to set the context for you. So Jesus is teaching in the temple courts. And at this point in the Bible, people regard Jesus as a few things. Some people think he's kind of a rabbi teacher. Some people think he's some sort of prophet. Some people think that maybe he is the Messiah, God kind of come to earth. And he's teaching and people are gathering and there's a bit of kind of a revolution, a bit of a movement starting. And people are gathered in the temple courts and Jesus starts to teach. And this is what he says. And this is how it starts. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. We'll stop there. So what's happening here is you've got the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they're both really groups of religious leaders. And they really don't like the fact that Jesus has kind of got this movement going. And these guys are all about the rules. I mean, they know about all the rules of Scripture, all the regulations they should be following. In fact, they've sometimes, in particular the Pharisees, have added rules on top of the rules to make sure they wouldn't break the other ones. And they're all about the rules. And they don't like this sort of movement that Jesus is starting. And they want to poke holes in his arguments. And they want to kind of trap him. And so the Sadducees have tried, prior to this in the passage, they've asked Jesus about marriage and about the resurrection and about life. And they've kind of struck out. So the Pharisees kind of inch forward. They're kind of heavyweight champion of the Pharisees, an expert in the law. And he comes to Jesus and he asks him this question. Verse 36. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in all the law? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if you're like me, and you're a little on the rules side, you read that and you say, really, Jesus? Love God and love others? Like, isn't that kind of just relational? Like, what about the rules and all the boundaries? Like, love God, love others? Like, is Jesus a Beatles fan too? Like, how can it be that it's just about love? I mean, there's got to be more to it. What about the rules? What about the boundaries? Well, if you're feeling that way, the Pharisees and the Sadducees would be feeling that way even more so because their whole life was built on the rules. Their whole life was built on the boundaries. And Jesus is saying, love God, love others. Those are the greatest commandments. That's so relational. But then Jesus says something that really changes everything. And this is what he says. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. What Jesus does here is he takes relationship and he takes rules and he fuses them together. And he said that the rules hang on the relationship. That the rules hang on the relationship. I'll give you an example of that. My wife, and if you haven't met her, her name's Leslie, and I mean, she's my hero. I mean, anybody who puts up with a high-maintenance husband like me is a hero. And Leslie is someone that I just love. And when I focus on my relationship with her, when I focus on how much I love her, when I focus on who she is and how much I just want this relationship to be great, the things that I should do just kind of come naturally. I think, I probably should clean the toilets. I know she hates that job, right? Or, she commutes and I'll try to have dinner on the table. Or, maybe I'll try some romance. I'm the only source of romance she's got, and I'm kind of klutzy when it comes to it, but I'll give it a shot. And And when I put my relationship with her first, then all the things that I should do just come naturally. But when I violate the rules, when I violate the principles, when I violate the rules, I violate the relationship. When I say, I'm not going to clean the toilets. We're going to leave them dirty. I'm not going to help out around the house. I'm not going to do the things that I need to do. I'm not going to hold my weight. When I violate those rules, I violate the relationship. That rules actually hang on relationship. Rules actually hang on relationship. So what does that mean for us as parents if the rules hang on the relationship? Because it sounds like it's not supposed to be about, I'm on the rules one day, I'm on the relationship the other, I'm on the rules side one day, I'm on the relationship the other. If the rules hang on the relationship, what does that mean? I remember the first time that I discovered this. I was working at Ontario Pioneer Camp just north of here. I was a section director. And I was working with the 12-year-old boys. So we had about 40 12-year-old boys, all their staff. And we had a young camper who arrived named Mark. Now, Mark wasn't one for the rules and the boundaries. And when he arrived, we explained all the rules and the boundaries, and he was happy to hear about them in a general way. But when we went to talk to him about his choices specifically, he didn't do very well. In fact, he just ran. Like literally, barefoot, socks, shoes, it didn't matter. He just bolted right into the woods. And of course, camp kind of has a rule that kids can't just randomly be living in the woods. And so I would have to chase after him. And so I would chase after him, and I would find him. And I remember eating meals in the woods, just watching him like hit a stick against a tree. And eventually he'd come back, and I'd sit him down. And I'd teach him, the best argument for why we have these rules in place. The rules are important, Mark, because they keep us safe. The boundaries are important because we need to be fair to everyone. Here's the 10 reasons why you need to follow these rules. An hour and a half later, radio call. Mark took off again. We can't find him. He's somewhere in the woods. I'd be out again, running through the woods, and like the miles I put on my running shoes that session. It was unbelievable. And eventually I went to the director of the camp, who we called Mo. And I said to him, what do I do? I mean, you talk to him about the rules, you talk to him about the boundaries, but when it comes right down to implementing them, he just takes off. Mo said, well, let me spend some time with him. So I thought, okay. So Mo spent a little time with him, and Mo says to him, when you take off like that, I want you to come by my office because I'll have a chocolate bar waiting for you. And I'm thinking, a chocolate bar? This isn't going to work. This is making it worse. I mean, I want to run to your office if you've got a chocolate bar. And so an hour and a half later, Mark takes off and he runs into the woods and eventually he ends up in Mo's office. Mo has a big window and I'm sitting outside and I'm watching them. And they're having a conversation. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. They're halfway through their Kit Kat, looks tasty. 10 more minutes. Then Mark leaves. A few hours later, he takes off again. He ends up at the office again, another half hour. And Mo started to get to know Mark's story and who he was and started to build a relationship with him. And as the week went on, Mark was taking off less and less and less. He was more open to the rules. He was more open to the boundaries. He was more open to what was happening at camp. Because you see, Mo understood something that I didn't. That you listen most to those you love the most. And you value most those who value you. And Mo knew the key to hanging the rules on the relationship. And he knew how important it was to build that relationship with Mark. Now, some of you are here and you're saying, okay, like all this relationship talk, it's all warm and fuzzy, but what about rules? What about boundaries? What about curfew and timeouts and the naughty step and like all those things? I mean, my kids need to have some principles. I need to teach them something. I mean, have a legacy to leave. I mean, what about the boundaries? What about the rules? And I'm not saying that those things aren't important. But as I look at what Jesus has to say in Scripture, and as I fight for the heart of my own kids, and as I work with students, there's something that I think I'm learning, a key principle from what Jesus is saying here. And if you haven't heard anything this morning, don't miss this. You have to communicate who you value before you communicate what you value. You have to communicate who you value before you communicate what you value. Now, it's not that the what you values aren't important. I mean, those things are important. And the what you values are things like, you know, I want to teach my kids honesty, so I have a rule that they have to tell the truth. And I want my kids to be respectful, so I have a rule that they have to speak to people with respect. Or I want them to learn the value of hard work, so I have a rule about homework. I have a rule about a clean room, or I have a chore schedule. I mean, those what you values are important. But the who you value, when you communicate those things, they're so powerful. Who you value says, I love you no matter what. Who you value says, this is a love and grace-based family, not a performance-based family. When you communicate who you love, you communicate, you know what? I love your mom or I love your dad more than anybody here on earth. Or you communicate, you know, it's just you and I together in this family, but I love you. Or you communicate, my relationship with God is the most important thing. That's who I value most, and I want that for you. See, we need to communicate what we value in the context of who we value. And it's at that point that you move from fighting with your kids to fighting for your kids. You move from fighting with them to fighting for them when you communicate in a way that gives the relationship value. Now, a lot of us try something a little bit different, and I'm so guilty of this. We try to modify behavior. And if you've got kids my age, like the 0 to 10 age range, this works really well. It's all about, if you do something I don't want you to do, I'm going to take away a privilege. And if you do something I want you to do, I'm going to give you a privilege. So the real simple example is, you know, we shouldn't be throwing the ball in the house. We just had this at my house the other day. We're going to take that ball and we're going to put it away for the day. And it's all about trading what we value. You do what I want, I'll do what you want. You do what I want, I'll give you what you want. And for those of you who have teenagers, you'll know this. That once your kids become teenagers, that doesn't really work anymore. And you call me. And you say, last night my daughter was sitting in her room. And there's nothing in there but a bed because I've taken everything away. And she still wouldn't listen to me. And I was standing at the door and I was banging on the door and I was yelling, you have to listen to me because I'm your father. And it still didn't work. Or the flip side, my son's in his room and he won't listen to me. And he's got the Xbox and a TV and a computer and an iPhone and he's got headphones on and I'm at the door and I'm banging at the door saying, I've given you all those things. How come you don't respect me? Listen to me, I'm your mother. And it didn't work. And that's because it's so focused on what we value, not who we value. It's just trading what we value with one another. It's not about relationship. And if you're a parent in kind of, you know, my demographic where you've got young ones, we got to start this early. Communicating who we value before we communicate what we value. We've got to get into this pattern early on. And it's so important that we figure this out. And we need to figure it out, and I'll tell you why, because I don't want to live in a fear-based parenting environment where I'm running from the rules to the relationship, to the rules to the relationship, and it's, oh, I don't know, maybe we should be more relationship, and I don't know, maybe we should be more rules, and I'm running back and forth, and we're parenting on the defense. It's not what we want for our kids, it's what we don't want for them. And so we got to figure this out. How practically do we communicate who we value before we communicate what we value? How do we do that in a practical way? Well, I've got a bunch of examples I'm going to share with you this morning of how you can do this. Maybe for you, you need to sit down with maybe another parent who's in that relationship with you and have a conversation. Because for some of you, you've got one parent who can be rules-based and one parent who can be relationship-based. And so you're just undermining one another. And you need to get on the same page and figure out how you're going to do this. Or maybe you're a single parent and one day you're on one side and one day you're on the other side, and you need to move from that model to looking at what Jesus has laid out for us here, communicating who you value before you communicate what you value. Maybe you're a rules-based dad, and if you are, I'm with you. And because it's about rules and boundaries and principles and legacy and all those things that I think are important. And it's not that those things aren't important, it's that communicating them in a way that gives the relationship value. So instead of, you know that curfew's midnight, and you weren't back by midnight, so there are going to be consequences. It's not that the value is not wrong, it's that the way it's being communicated doesn't communicate value in who the student is. And maybe it looks something like, you know, we understand it's important that you have friends. And you know, I understand it's important that you want to have friendship, and we want you to have friends. But you need to know that I really start to worry and really get concerned when you're out past midnight, and I'd really appreciate it if you kept to the curfew time of 12 o'clock. That's communicating in a context of who you value, not just what you value. Maybe you're a relational person. Maybe it's all about relationship, and it's time for you to communicate some boundaries, to communicate some rules. You know, honey, I love our relationship, and I love the fact that we can talk to one another, but I'm more than just a friend. I'm also your parent, and I've got some concerns about the choices that you're making, and I think we need to have a conversation about boundaries. I think we need to have a conversation about how best to approach some of these things. You know, when it comes to communicating who you value before what you value, maybe you're a student here today and you need to do that with your parents. The what you value is so easy because, you know, in some ways your parents are the only place you can get any money, right? So you need this, and you need that, and you need this, and it's all about what you value, and it's not about who you value. And maybe you got those in the wrong order. For some of you, you haven't given your son a hug in a long time. A long time. Especially dads. And maybe it's time. Now, you know, if your son's 13, I wouldn't start with like a full bear hug, but like a side hug to start. But maybe it's time to, in a physical way, show them that you think they're valuable, that you care. You know, maybe as a parent, you need to stand across from your son or daughter. You need to put your hand on their shoulder. You need to look them in the eye. And you need to tell them, I count it a privilege to be your parent. Whether they're 13 or 30. I count it a privilege to be your parent. And I value you. And I value who you're becoming. And I know it's messy. And I know sometimes we fight. But man, you matter to me. Maybe it's time. And you might be sitting there and saying, gee, that sounds awkward. And if you're a parent of a teenager, I mean, your kids already think you're weird, so you don't have anything to lose. But the reality is, it is awkward. It is. And I think as parents, we need to start doing awkward things. Because I think the awkward things are often the most powerful things. I think that the awkward things are often the most powerful things. Because when you make those gestures, those awkward gestures that communicate value, you're being transparent. You're being authentic. You're taking the first step of trust. There's power in that. I mean, maybe you're here this morning and you need to call up one of your kids, or you need to talk face-to-face one of your kids, and you need to ask forgiveness for not valuing them. Awkward. Powerful. Life-changing. The beginning of something new. So my challenge to you this morning, my to-do for this week, is do one awkward thing that demonstrates value to your kids. Just one. And I'm not talking about like stuff you regularly do, like love you, good night. Not that easy stuff. Awkward stuff. Conversations that are direct about how you feel about them. Maybe your week is so jam-packed with stuff to do this week, you don't know how you'd find any time. And you're going to do the awkward thing, and you're going to cancel that meeting. You're going to make time for that father-daughter date you haven't had in weeks, in months. Maybe you haven't talked to your child in a long time. Maybe you haven't, an adult son or daughter, and you haven't talked to them in a long time. And it's time. It's time to call them. I mean, maybe you're a high school student here, and you feel really badly about how the relationship's going down with your parents. And maybe, you know what? It's time to do the awkward thing and start that conversation. I don't really know what to say, Mom. I don't really know what to say, Dad. But I know this isn't going well. And I want to have a conversation because I do value a relationship with you. Maybe what you need to do is start complimenting your child in front of other adults. I mean, I think this is a great way to do it. I mean, they're going to turn bright red. Have you met my daughter? I mean, she's in grade 4 and she works so hard on her spelling. And I would never work that hard on spelling. And we're so proud of her. Communicating who we value is so, so important. One of the things that I do as a part of the student ministry here is we take students to other countries to serve on compassion trips as part of a thing called Love Moves. And we do interviews as a part of those. And sometimes in an interview, especially if the student's small group leader is there, we take 3 minutes to sit across from that student and just tell them what we think is valuable about them. You would be shocked how many kids start crying because they've never heard it from an adult. I mean, communicating who we value. I mean, I can get so focused as a dad on the what, and the modifying the behaviors without showing that I value the relationship and who my kids are. I've probably been doing student ministry not working with students for almost 15 years between a high school teaching career, sort of a short stint, and then in student ministry. And in almost 15 years, the odd time you get to sit with a student who's at rock bottom. Usually happens in a hospital or a police station or a principal's office or in their living room sometimes. And it's a tough place to be. I've never once had a student say to me, I wish I would have followed all the rules and boundaries that my parents had made. Never. But most students, in their own way, say this: I have an adult in my life that I wish would value me. And now that I've messed this up, I don't know what's going to happen. We got to get this right. I could have brought this morning graphs and charts and statistics and books all about the value of students because, as the director of student ministry here, I feel in some senses I have an obligation to tell you that one of the number one, if not the number one issue in the lives of students, all the material says it, is they feel abandoned by adults. They feel like they're present but not seen. They feel like they're in this transitionary time in their life. I mean, the most transitionary, and there's no one there to tell them what to do. What if we decided to be a different kind of community? What if at Connexus we decided to be a church made up of families, as broken as we are, as broken as we can be, who said, you know what? This is where we're going to join God's story. The part of the story where God says, I love kids, I value kids, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure they know how valuable they are to us. We need to communicate that they're valuable to us on the who you value side, because after we do that, we've got some pretty valuable what we values right here in God's Word that we want to teach them, that we want them to pass on to them. We want principles we want them to know, boundaries God set out for them, exciting things that God wants for their life. But first they have to know that they're valued. What if we as a community decided to be that kind of place? What if we decided to be those kind of families? But we're going to start with one step, one small thing. Do one awkward thing that communicates to your kids that you value them this week. Let's pray. God, thanks so much for your love for us. That you valued us first, to the point that you sent your Son to die for us. That you loved us first. That you sacrificed for us first. That you showed you cared first. God, help us to model that in our families. Help us to model that with our kids. Help us to show them how much we value them. Help us to do the awkward thing. And God, it can be so awkward. Give us the courage. Give us the strength. Give us the opportunity. Because we've got so many principles and so many great things that you've laid out in your word that we want to share with these kids, in our families and in our church community. And God, I pray for the students who need to tell their parents that they value them, who need to tell their parents that they care about them, who need to have that open and honest, totally awkward conversation, that you would give them the courage to have that too. Thanks for who you are. Our Father, the greatest parent we could ever have. In your name, amen.